The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying wasps, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that made even the youngest faces look tired. I shifted in my plastic chair, the kind that squeaked no matter how carefully you moved, and checked my watch. 7:18 p.m. 12 minutes until Professor Martinez would shuffle in with his worn leather satchel and that perpetual expression of mild disappointment, as if he'd expected better from both the world and this particular classroom in the basement of the community arts building. I shouldn't have been there. That was the thought that had been circling my mind for 3 weeks now, ever since I'd impulsively signed up for modern American literature, Voices of Dissent, during what my sister charitably called my quarter-life crisis phase. The registration deadline had been that afternoon, and I'd been sitting in my cubicle at the insurance office staring at a spreadsheet of auto claims when something inside me just broke. Not dramatically, more like a rubber band that had been stretched too long and finally gave up with a quiet snap. 24 years old, and I felt like I was sleepwalking through my own life. So I'd driven to the college during my lunch break, filled out the paperwork, and written a check for $340 that I probably couldn't afford. Night classes seemed manageable. Something to fill the empty hours between dinner and sleep, to give me a reason to think about something other than deductibles and policy renewals. The classroom held maybe 30 people on a good night, though we rarely hit that number. Most were older than me, returning students with tired eyes and the particular brand of determination that comes from second chances. A few were closer to my age, probably in similar situations. Stuck, searching, or just plain bored. We'd settled into an unspoken arrangement over the past few weeks. The back rows filled up first, everyone maintaining careful distances like we were all carrying some kind of contagious disappointment. I always sat in the same spot. Third row from the back, left side, aisle seat. Easy escape route if needed, close enough to hear but far enough to avoid unwanted attention. The seat next to me had remained empty since the semester started, which suited me fine. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to… Well, I wasn't entirely sure what I was there for, but it definitely wasn't social interaction. The door creaked open at 7:25, and I glanced up expecting to see Professor Martinez with his predictable 5 minutes late arrival. Instead, someone I'd never seen before stepped into the room. He paused in the doorway for just a moment, scanning the scattered students with an unhurried gaze that somehow managed to take in everything without seeming intrusive. He was probably around my age, maybe a year or two older. Medium height with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it on the walk over. He wore a navy sweater that had seen better days but fit him well, and jeans that were faded in all the right places. There was something about the way he carried himself, not confident exactly, but comfortable, like he belonged wherever he happened to be standing. Our eyes met for just a second across the dim classroom, and he offered a small nod before starting down the aisle. I looked back at my notebook, pretending to review my notes from last week's discussion of Kerouac, but I was aware of his movement in my peripheral vision. He was walking down my row. The plastic chair beside me scraped against the floor as he settled into it, and I caught a whiff of something clean and warm. Not cologne, just soap maybe, and the faint smell of coffee. He placed a worn canvas messenger bag on the floor and pulled out a spiral notebook, the kind with a black and white speckled cover that I hadn't seen anyone use since high school. "Sorry," he said quietly, as his elbow brushed against my arm while he adjusted his position. His voice was lower than I'd expected, with just the slightest rasp to it. "No problem," I managed, though my voice came out rougher than intended. I cleared my throat and tried to focus on the blank page in front of me. Professor Martinez chose that moment to arrive, fumbling with his keys and muttering something about traffic as he unlocked his desk drawer. The familiar routine began, papers shuffling, attendance called in a monotone voice that somehow made even interesting names sound bureaucratic. When he got to the W's without calling a name I didn't recognize, I realized the guy next to me was auditing the class or had registered late. "Tonight we're diving into James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room," Martinez announced, pulling a paperback from his bag. The cover was creased and worn, obviously a personal copy he'd been teaching from for years. "I want to talk about internal exile, about the ways we can be strangers to ourselves." I'd read the assignment twice, once quickly and once more slowly, trying to understand why certain passages had made my chest feel tight. Baldwin wrote about longing with a precision that felt almost surgical. laying bare the anatomy of desire and shame with sentences that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. As Martinez began his lecture, I became acutely aware of the person beside me. Not in an obvious way. I didn't stare or try to read his notes. But there was something about his presence that seemed to change the air around us. Maybe it was the way he listened, leaning slightly forward with complete focus, or the way he occasionally nodded at something Martinez said, small movements that suggested he was not just hearing, but actually thinking about the words. I found myself listening more carefully too, as if his attention was somehow contagious. Baldwin writes about Paris as a place of possibility, Martinez was saying, but also of isolation. David flees America, but he carries his shame with him. Geography can't cure what's inside us. The guy next to me wrote something in his notebook, and I couldn't help but notice his handwriting. Neat but not precious, with a slight forward slant that suggested someone who thought faster than he wrote. There was something intimate about watching someone take notes, I realized. It was like seeing their thoughts take physical form, watching them decide what was worth remembering. I tried to focus on my own notes, but I kept finding my attention drifting. The way his sleeve fell back when he reached for his pen, revealing a glimpse of his wrist. The way he held his head when he was concentrating, chin tilted down just slightly. The way he seemed to inhabit his space so naturally, while I felt like I was constantly adjusting and readjusting, never quite finding the right position. The relationship between David and Giovanni, Martinez continued, is built on a foundation of temporary honesty. They can be themselves with each other, but only within the walls of that room, only for those few months. It's honesty with an expiration date. Something about that phrase, honesty with an expiration date, hit me harder than it should have. I wrote it down, then immediately felt self-conscious about the fact that I'd written it down. Did it seem significant? Would he notice what I was writing? I glanced over without meaning to and caught him looking at my notebook. Our eyes met for a brief second before we both looked away, but not before I saw something that might have been curiosity in his expression. The lecture continued for another 40 minutes, but I found myself paying as much attention to the quiet presence beside me as to Martinez's analysis of Baldwin's prose. There was something almost meditative about it. The soft sound of his pen moving across paper, the way he occasionally shifted in his chair, the steady rhythm of his breathing. When Martinez finally announced our 10-minute break, half the class filed out for coffee or cigarettes. I usually stayed put, using the time to review my notes or just sit in the blessed quiet. But tonight, the guy next to me didn't move either. He leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms above his head, and I caught another hint of that clean, warm smell. "Do you always take this class this seriously?" he asked, and it took me a moment to realize he was talking to me. His voice held just a hint of amusement, but not in a way that felt mocking. I looked down at my notebook, which was indeed covered in more detailed notes than usual. "Do you always notice?" I replied, surprising myself with the response. He smiled. Not a big grin, just a small curve at the corner of his mouth that somehow changed his entire face. "Fair point," he said. "I'm Alex, by the way. Late registration. Couldn't decide between this and contemporary philosophy until literally yesterday." "Sam," I said, "what made you choose literature?" "Honestly, the time slot worked better with my schedule. I bartend at the Compass downtown, so evening classes are pretty much my only option." He paused, glancing at the Baldwin book still open on Martinez's desk. "Though I'm starting to think I made the right choice for other reasons too. This stuff is—" He trailed off, seeming to search for the right word. "Heavy?" I suggested. "Important," he said instead, and something in the way he said it made me look at him more closely. Before I could respond, Martinez cleared his throat, signaling the end of break. Students filtered back in, settling into their seats with the particular restlessness that came with the second half of a night class. But I found myself more alert than tired, more focused than I'd felt in weeks. The remainder of the lecture covered Baldwin's use of mirrors as a recurring motif, the way characters were constantly confronting distorted versions of themselves. Alex continued to take careful notes, occasionally underlining something or adding a question mark in the margin. At one point, when Martinez read a particularly striking passage about David's self-loathing, I saw Alex's pen pause above the page for a long moment before he continued writing. "For next week," Martinez announced as 9:30 approached, I want you to read the rest of Giovanni's Room and come prepared to discuss the ending. Think about what Baldwin is saying about the price of authenticity, about the cost of living honestly in a world that punishes honesty. The familiar sounds of a class ending filled the room. Chairs scraping, papers rustling, bags zipping closed. But both Alex and I moved slowly, taking our time putting our notebooks away, neither of us seeming eager to rush into the night. I was usually one of the first people out the door, but tonight I found myself double-checking that I had everything, reorganizing the contents of my backpack, anything to stretch out these final moments. Alex seemed to be doing the same thing, carefully placing his notebook in his messenger bag, checking his phone, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. We stood at almost the same moment, and our bags brushed against each other as we shifted into the aisle. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a small jolt through me that I couldn't quite explain. The classroom emptied around us as we walked slowly toward the door. Martinez was already gone, and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless tune over the abandoned plastic chairs. Our footsteps echoed slightly in the empty hallway outside, and I was acutely aware that in a few seconds we would reach the main entrance and probably head in different directions, back to our separate lives. It was just a night class, just a stranger who had chosen the seat beside me. But suddenly, I couldn't imagine sitting through another evening without that quiet presence at my side. We reached the heavy glass doors that led to the parking lot, and Alex paused with his hand on the metal handle. The hallway was dimly lit, all the offices dark, and through the glass I could see the scattered pools of light from the parking lot street lamps. He turned to look at me, and in the half-light his expression was serious, almost questioning. For a moment, neither of us said anything, and I had the strange feeling that we were standing at the edge of something, though I couldn't say what. "See you next week?" he asked softly, and there was something in his voice, a note of genuine hope maybe, or uncertainty, that made the simple question feel like it carried more weight than it should. I nodded, not trusting my voice to sound casual. "Yeah, same seat?" "Same seat," he confirmed, and that small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth again before he pushed open the door and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment longer, watching his silhouette cross the parking lot until he disappeared behind a row of cars. Then I walked to my own car, a 10-year-old Honda that started on the third try, and sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before turning the key. The drive home was the same route I took every Tuesday and Thursday night, down College Avenue, left on Main, right on Elm to my small apartment above the bakery. But tonight, the familiar streets looked different somehow, like I was seeing them through new eyes. The traffic lights seemed brighter, the shadows deeper, the whole world suddenly more vivid than it had been just 3 hours earlier. I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and set my backpack on the small table that served as both desk and dining room. The space felt smaller than usual, quieter. I made a cup of tea and opened Giovanni's Room to the page we'd left off on, but I found myself reading the same paragraph over and over, my mind elsewhere. I kept thinking about the way Alex had listened during the lecture, the complete attention he'd given to Martinez's words, the way his handwriting slanted forward across the page, the brief moment when our eyes had met over my notebook, and the curiosity I thought I'd seen there. The way he'd said important when talking about Baldwin's writing, like he understood something about it that went beyond academic analysis. And the way he'd asked, "See you next week?" as if my answer actually mattered to him. I closed the book and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment. 2 hours ago, I'd been going through the motions of my Tuesday night routine. Class, notes, drive home, prepare for another day at the insurance office. Now I was counting the days until Thursday, calculating how many hours I had to wait before I could sit in that uncomfortable plastic chair again and hope that someone would choose the seat beside me. It was ridiculous, really. I barely knew him. We'd exchanged maybe 50 words total. He was probably just being polite, making conversation to pass the break time, asking about next week because that's what people do in classes. They acknowledge that they'll see each other again. But lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Like a door had opened that I hadn't even realized was there, revealing a room I'd never seen before. I fell asleep thinking about the way the fluorescent lights had caught in Alex's hair when he'd stretched during the break, and the sound of his voice when he'd said my name. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I'd never been someone who looked forward to things with any particular intensity. My life had settled into comfortable patterns: work, home, occasional dinners with my sister, the gym on Sundays. I was good at managing expectations, at not getting too excited about anything that might disappoint me. But Wednesday dragged by with excruciating slowness. Every time I looked at the clock on my computer screen, convinced that hours had passed, only 20 or 30 minutes would have gone by. I found myself distracted during meetings, losing track of conversations about policy renewals and claim adjustments. My coworkers probably thought I was coming down with something. Maybe I was. Thursday evening found me sitting in my car in the college parking lot 20 minutes early, trying to talk myself out of the nervous energy that had been building all day. I'd changed clothes 3 times before leaving my apartment, settling finally on jeans and a gray sweater that I hoped looked casual but not sloppy. I'd even considered stopping by the campus bookstore to buy a different notebook, something that might seem more intellectual than my standard spiral bound, but that felt too calculated, too obvious. I was overthinking everything. It was just a class. Alex was just another student who happened to sit next to me. The fact that I'd spent the better part of 2 days replaying our brief conversation was probably a sign that I needed to get out more, not that anything significant was happening. But when I walked into the classroom at 7:20 and saw that the seat next to mine was still empty, my heart rate picked up in a way that definitely wasn't casual. I settled into my usual spot and tried to look absorbed in reviewing my notes from Tuesday's lecture, but my attention kept drifting to the door. Other students trickled in. Margaret, the middle-aged accountant who always sat in the front row. Tom, the guy with the elaborate tattoo sleeve who never spoke but took meticulous notes. Sarah, who worked at the hospital and sometimes came straight from her shift still wearing scrubs. 7:25 came and went, then 7:28. Professor Martinez arrived at exactly 7:30, as always, but there was still no sign of Alex. I tried to focus on Martinez's opening remarks about Baldwin's treatment of American identity, but I kept glancing at the empty chair beside me. Maybe he'd decided to drop the class. Maybe Tuesday had been a one-time thing, a trial run that hadn't held his interest. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing: the careful attention, the thoughtful questions, the way he'd asked about next week as if he actually wanted to know. I was being ridiculous. People missed classes all the time. He could be sick or stuck at work or dealing with any number of ordinary complications. The fact that I was sitting there feeling disappointed was just evidence of how little excitement my life typically contained. Which brings us to the scene in the bathroom mirror, Martinez was saying, and I forced myself to pay attention. David's moment of recognition, of seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time. The door creaked open. I didn't look up immediately, afraid to seem too eager, but I could feel rather than see someone walking down the aisle toward the back of the room. My peripheral vision caught the familiar navy sweater, the canvas messenger bag, and relief flooded through me so suddenly that I had to take a careful breath to steady myself. Alex slipped into the seat beside me with minimal disruption, offering a quiet "sorry" to me and a small nod toward Martinez. He pulled out his notebook and immediately began writing, catching up on whatever he'd missed. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, noting the same careful attention to the lecture, the same slight forward lean that indicated complete focus. "Traffic," he whispered during a brief pause as Martinez searched for a particular passage in his book. Highway 9 was completely backed up. I nodded, probably more enthusiastically than the situation warranted, and tried to refocus on the lecture. But I was acutely aware that the nervous energy I'd been carrying all day had transformed into something else entirely, a sense of rightness like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The rest of the class passed in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. Martinez led a discussion about Baldwin's portrayal of shame and desire, about the ways his character struggled with authenticity in a world that demanded conformity. Alex participated more tonight, offering observations that revealed he'd clearly done more than just skim the reading. "Baldwin doesn't give us easy answers," Alex said during one exchange about the novel's ending. "Giovanni dies, David remains trapped in his self-hatred, and the woman he's supposed to marry is left in limbo. It's not redemptive in any traditional sense." "But what about the act of testimony itself?" asked Sarah from the front row. "Isn't there something powerful about David finally telling the story, even if it doesn't save anyone?" Alex considered this for a moment, pen poised above his notebook. "Maybe, But there's a difference between confession and transformation. David tells us what happened, but I'm not convinced he's changed because of the telling. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's an excellent distinction. The question becomes whether bearing witness to our own complicity is enough, or whether authentic change requires something more active. I found myself scribbling notes not just about Baldwin, but about the discussion itself, about the way Alex engaged with ideas, seriously, but without pretension, willing to sit with complexity rather than rushing toward easy conclusions. There was something compelling about watching his mind work, seeing how he processed and responded to challenging material. During the break, we both stayed in our seats again. This time, instead of commenting on my note-taking, Alex asked, "What did you think about the ending? When you first read it, I mean." I'd been dreading this question all week, afraid that my reaction had been too personal, too revealing. Honestly, it made me angry. Angry how? At David, I guess, for being so cowardly, for destroying Giovanni and then feeling sorry for himself about it. I paused, wondering if I was saying too much. It felt like he wanted credit for suffering without taking responsibility for the damage he'd caused. Alex nodded slowly. I can see that, though I wonder if Baldwin is asking us to be angry at David. Maybe the anger is the point. We're supposed to be frustrated with the waste of it all. You think Baldwin is critiquing David, not trying to make us sympathize with him? Both, maybe. David is a victim of a homophobic society, but he's also complicit in perpetuating that violence. Baldwin holds both truths at the same time. Alex glanced at his notebook, where he'd written something I couldn't quite read. It's like he's saying that being oppressed doesn't automatically make you innocent. The insight was sharp and thoughtful, and I found myself looking at Alex with new appreciation. We'd moved beyond small talk into something that felt more substantial, more real. That's a pretty harsh reading, I said. Is it? Or is it honest? He met my eyes directly. Sometimes I think we confuse kindness with truth. Baldwin isn't kind to David, but he might be telling the truth about him. The distinction stuck with me for the rest of the class. As Martinez wrapped up his lecture and assigned the next reading, excerpts from Giovanni's Room and several critical essays, I kept thinking about the difference between kindness and truth, between sympathy and accountability. When class ended, Alex and I again found ourselves packing up slowly, neither eager to rush into the parking lot. But tonight there was less awkwardness, more of a natural rhythm to our movements. We walked toward the door together, and I realized I was hoping he'd suggest continuing the conversation somewhere else, coffee maybe, or just a longer walk to our cars. Instead, when we reached the main entrance, he turned to me with that same serious expression I remembered from Tuesday. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told me, "about being angry at David. I think you're right to be angry. I think Baldwin wants us to be angry. Even if David is a victim too? Especially then. Being a victim doesn't give you the right to victimize others. Baldwin knew that." Alex shifted his messenger bag to his other shoulder. "Anyway, I just wanted you to know that your reaction wasn't wrong. It was actually pretty insightful." Something warm expanded in my chest at the validation, at the fact that he'd been thinking about our conversation. "Thanks. I was worried I was being too emotional about it." "Emotion isn't the opposite of intelligence," Alex said. "Sometimes it's the only intelligent response." We'd reached his car, a dark blue Honda that looked only slightly newer than mine, and he paused with his keys in his hand. "See you next week?" he asked again, but this time the question felt different. Less tentative, more like the beginning of something that could become routine. "Definitely," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. I watched him drive away, then sat in my own car for a few minutes, replaying the conversation in my mind. The way he'd listened to my thoughts about Baldwin with genuine attention. The way he'd built on my ideas rather than dismissing or correcting them. The way he'd looked at me when he said that emotion wasn't the opposite of intelligence, like he understood something about me that I was only beginning to understand myself. Driving home, I realized I was already looking forward to next Tuesday with an intensity that should have worried me but somehow didn't. Instead, it felt like waking up after a long sleep, like discovering that the world contained possibilities I'd forgotten existed. Back in my apartment, I made tea and opened the Baldwin book again, but this time I read with different eyes. looking for the places where the author held compassion and judgment in tension, where he refused to choose between kindness and truth. I thought about Alex's insights, about the way he'd framed David's story as both tragedy and cautionary tale. And I thought about the way he'd said my name when we were discussing the novel, like it was worth taking care with, worth pronouncing correctly. It was still just a night class. Alex was still someone I barely knew. But something was definitely happening. Something that felt both terrifying and essential, like the first notes of a song I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. Part 2. By the third week, we had developed what I could only call a routine, though calling it that made it sound more mundane than it felt. I would arrive at 7:15 claiming the same seat I'd occupied since the semester began. Alex would appear 5 minutes later, never rushed, despite his apparent tendency toward lateness, settling into the chair beside me with the kind of easy familiarity that suggested he'd been sitting there for years rather than days. Our chairs had begun to angle slightly toward each other, a gradual shift so subtle I might not have noticed it if I hadn't been paying such careful attention to everything about those Tuesday and Thursday evenings. It wasn't a conscious adjustment, at least I don't think it was. More like the natural result of two people learning to exist in the same small space, finding the angles that allowed for the occasional shared glance or whispered comment without disrupting the flow of Martinez's lectures. The evening we discussed Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, Alex slid his notebook a few inches closer to the invisible line between our seats, angling it so I could see his margin notes during Martinez's analysis of Plath's treatment of mental illness. His handwriting was smaller than mine, more precise, filled with questions and observations that revealed a mind that didn't accept easy interpretations. Esther's depression isn't romanticized, he'd written. P shows the banality of despair, how it makes everything gray, not tragic. Lower on the page, the bell jar as metaphor for isolation but also distortion. The world looks different from inside, but you can still see it. I found myself leaning slightly closer to read his thoughts, close enough to catch that familiar scent of soap and coffee, close enough to notice the way he held his pen, loosely, like someone who was confident in his words. When I glanced up, I caught him watching me read his notes with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not self-conscious exactly, but curious about my reaction. "What do you think?" he whispered during one of Martinez's longer pauses. I gestured toward his comment about the bell jar. That's exactly right. It's not about being cut off from the world. It's about seeing it wrong. He nodded, adding a small check mark next to the observation as if my agreement had confirmed something for him. The gesture was tiny, insignificant to anyone else, but it sent a warm pulse through my chest. My opinion mattered to him, at least about this. As the weeks passed, these small exchanges became more frequent. A raised eyebrow when Martinez made one of his more pretentious pronouncements. A shared smile when a classmate asked a question that revealed they clearly hadn't done the reading. The kind of wordless communication that develops between people who spend time observing the same things, who begin to develop a shared sense of humor about their environment. It was supposed to be just a lecture, but it felt like more, like the world had shrunk to the span of one desk, one shared silence, one stolen glance. I started looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an intensity that was beginning to worry me. Not because the anticipation was unpleasant, but because it was so much more vivid than anything else in my week. Monday and Wednesday dragged by like background music. Friday through Sunday felt like intermission. But Tuesday and Thursday evenings had weight, texture, significance. The fourth week brought us to Virginia Woolf, and Martinez assigned passages from Mrs. Dalloway that required careful attention to stream of consciousness technique. I'd read the selection twice and still felt like I was grasping at something just beyond my reach. Woolf's sentences flowed and eddied like water, beautiful but elusive. "I don't think I'm getting this," I admitted to Alex during the break, gesturing at my notebook, which contained more question marks than actual insights. "Which part?" "All of it? The way she moves between characters' thoughts, the way time works in the novel. It's like she's writing in a completely different language." Alex considered this, flipping through his own notes. "What if that's the point? What if she's trying to show us that consciousness itself doesn't follow linear rules? Meaning? Think about how your mind actually works during any given day. You're thinking about what you need to buy at the grocery store, but then you smell something that reminds you of your childhood. So suddenly you're remembering your grandmother's kitchen, but then you notice a woman across the street who looks like someone you used to know. And now you're thinking about high school. He paused, meeting my eyes. Wolf is trying to capture that, the way our minds move through time and space simultaneously. The explanation clicked something into place for me. So the confusion is intentional. She's making us experience what it's like to be inside someone else's consciousness. Exactly. And consciousness is messy and non-linear and full of interruptions. Alex's voice carried a note of enthusiasm that I was beginning to recognize, the way he sounded when an idea genuinely excited him. The difficulty isn't a bug, it's a feature. When Martinez resumed the lecture, I found myself following Wolf's prose with new understanding, letting the associations and interruptions wash over me rather than fighting them for clarity. And I found myself stealing glances at Alex, wondering about the stream of his own consciousness, what thoughts and memories were flowing through his mind during those moments when he stared thoughtfully at the professor or absently tapped his pen against his notebook. After class that night, we walked toward the parking lot more slowly than usual. It had rained earlier in the evening, and the asphalt reflected the streetlights in wavering pools of orange light. The air smelled clean and electric, charged with the possibility of more rain. "Thanks for helping me understand Wolf," I said, as we passed under one of the lampposts. "Thanks for letting me explain it. Sometimes I don't know what I think about something until I try to say it out loud." We'd reached the point where we usually separated toward our respective cars, but neither of us moved in that direction. Instead, we stood under the streetlight, and I became aware of how quiet the campus was at this hour. Just the distant hum of traffic on the main road and the soft drip of water from the rain gutters. "Can I ask you something?" Alex said. "Of course. Why did you take this class? I mean, really, you don't seem like someone who needed the credits or was looking for an easy elective." The question caught me off guard, maybe because I'd been wondering the same thing about him. Honestly, I think I was looking for something, but I didn't know what. My life felt. I searched for the right words. Small, I guess, predictable. I thought maybe reading about other people's experiences would help me figure out what was missing from my own. Alex nodded like this made perfect sense to him. "Has it? Helped you figure it out?" I looked at him standing under the streetlight, his dark hair slightly damp from the earlier rain, his expression open and genuinely curious about my answer. The honest response was that the class had helped me figure out something, but it wasn't what I'd expected to discover. I'd come looking for meaning in literature and instead found myself paying attention to the way someone took notes, the sound of a particular voice saying my name, the anticipation of seeing a familiar figure walk through a classroom door. "I think so," I said finally. "What about you? Why literature instead of philosophy?" "Maybe the same reason as you. Looking for something." He paused, seeming to consider how much to reveal. "I've been tending bar for 3 years, and I love parts of it. The conversations, the way you get to observe people when they think no one's watching. But I started feeling like I was just collecting other people's stories without having any of my own." "And you thought literature would give you stories?" "I thought it might teach me how to recognize them, how to tell the difference between things that happen and things that matter." Alex looked at me directly. "Does that make sense?" It made more sense than I wanted to admit. "Yeah, it does." We stood there for another moment, and I had the feeling we were circling around something important, something that neither of us was quite ready to name. The parking lot stretched out around us, mostly empty except for a handful of cars belonging to night shift workers and the occasional student burning the midnight oil in the library. "I should probably get going," Alex said eventually, though he didn't sound like he particularly wanted to. "Yeah, me too." But we still didn't move. Instead, we both seemed to be memorizing the moment, the quality of light, the sound of our voices in the quiet air, the way the distance between us felt both significant and insufficient. Finally, Alex shifted his messenger bag to his other shoulder, the movement breaking whatever spell had settled over us. "See you Thursday?" "Thursday," I confirmed. And this time when he walked away, I watched until his car pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared around the corner. Thursday's class focused on contemporary writers, and Martinez introduced us to Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. The prose was dense and lyrical, full of imagery that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper. Vuong wrote about language and identity, about the weight of family history, about desire that couldn't be easily categorized or contained. Alex was particularly quiet during the discussion, taking notes but not participating in the conversation the way he usually did. I found myself glancing at him more frequently than normal, trying to read his expression, wondering if the material was affecting him the way it was affecting me. During the break, instead of staying in the classroom, he stood up and headed toward the door. "Need some air?" he said quietly as he passed my seat. I waited a few minutes, then followed him outside. I found him sitting on one of the concrete benches near the building entrance, staring out at the parking lot. The night was clearer than Tuesday had been, with stars visible despite the ambient light from the campus. "You okay?" I asked, settling onto the bench beside him. "Yeah, just that Vuong piece is intense." He rubbed his hands together, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. "There's something about the way he writes about family, about inherited trauma. It hits close to home." I waited, sensing that he might want to say more but not wanting to push. "My parents don't speak to me," Alex said after a long pause. "Haven't for about 2 years now. Nothing dramatic, just we couldn't find a way to understand each other." The revelation felt significant, like he was offering me something valuable and fragile. "I'm sorry, that must be difficult." "It is. But reading Vuong, the way he writes about the complexity of family love, how you can be grateful for people who also hurt you, it helps me think about it differently." Alex looked at me. "Does that make sense? Finding comfort in other people's complicated stories?" "Completely. That's what literature is for, isn't it? To help us feel less alone in our complications." Alex smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "You should be teaching this class." "Definitely not. I'm barely keeping up as a student." "I don't think that's true. You see things in the text that I miss. You ask questions that make me reconsider what I thought I understood." The compliment warmed me in a way that felt disproportionate to its actual content. "You do the same thing for me?" "I would have given up on Wolf completely if you hadn't helped me see what she was doing. So we're good for each other, intellectually speaking." There was something in the way he said "intellectually speaking" that suggested he was thinking about other ways we might be good for each other. But before I could examine that thought too closely, he was standing up, checking his watch. "We should probably get back," he said. "Martinez will be starting again soon." The second half of the class passed quickly, with Martinez leading us through Vuong's treatment of desire as both destructive and transformative. Alex participated more actively, offering insights about the way the author used language to create intimacy between reader and narrator. I found myself watching him as much as listening to him, noting the animation in his voice when he was engaged with an idea, the way his hands moved slightly when he was making a point. When class ended, we packed up our things with the same deliberate slowness that had become our unspoken tradition. But tonight felt different. There was an energy in the air between us, a sense of something approaching that neither of us was quite naming. "I think you're the only reason I haven't dropped this class," I said, as we walked toward the door, the words coming out before I'd fully decided to say them. Alex stopped walking and turned to look at me, his expression serious. "Then I guess I'll have to keep showing up." The simple statement carried more weight than it should have. It wasn't a declaration or a promise exactly, but it felt like an acknowledgement that something was happening between us, something that mattered enough to be worth protecting. We walked to the parking lot in comfortable silence, but when we reached the point where we usually separated, Alex hesitated. "Sam?" he said, and something in his tone made me turn to face him fully. "I know this might sound strange, but these Tuesday and Thursday nights have become important to me, more important than I expected when I signed up for the class." My heart did something complicated in my chest. "They're important to me, too." "Good. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't reading too much into things." "You're not." We stood there looking at each other in the orange glow of the parking lot lights, and I had the feeling we were both on the verge of saying something that would change the careful equilibrium we'd established. The air felt charged, full of possibility and risk. But then Alex smiled, that soft curve of his mouth that I'd come to anticipate and treasure, and the moment settled into something less urgent but no less significant. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," I agreed. The pattern continued through the 5th and 6th weeks. Our seats angled gradually closer together. Our shared glances became more frequent, more loaded with meaning. We developed an entire vocabulary of small gestures, the way Alex would tap his pen twice against his notebook when Martinez said something particularly pompous, The way I would raise my eyebrows slightly when a classmate asked a question we'd already covered. We were reading Toni Morrison now, Beloved, and the discussions had become more intense, more personal. Morrison's prose demanded careful attention, and her treatment of trauma, memory, and healing seemed to affect everyone in the class differently. Alex had grown quieter during the lectures, but his notes were more detailed than ever, filled with observations about Morrison's use of fragmented narrative and the way she made the past feel present. During a discussion about the nature of memory and forgetting, Sarah from the front row made a comment about how some experiences are too painful to remember clearly. Morrison shows us that forgetting isn't the opposite of remembering, Alex said, speaking up for the first time that evening. It's another way of holding on to something. Beloved exists because she's been forgotten, not in spite of it. Martinez nodded approvingly. Explain that further. The characters can't afford to remember Beloved fully. The trauma is too overwhelming. But by forgetting her, by trying to erase her, they ensure that she'll return in a different form. The forgetting becomes a kind of haunting. I found myself writing down his words, struck by the insight and the way he'd articulated it. When I looked up, I caught him watching me take notes on his comment, and something passed between us that felt like recognition, not just intellectual agreement, but a deeper kind of understanding. After class, we walked to the parking lot through air that carried the first hint of autumn. The leaves on the campus trees were beginning to turn, and there was a crispness that hadn't been there a few weeks earlier. Your point about forgetting and haunting, I said as we passed under the familiar streetlights. That was brilliant. Thanks. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, the way we carry things we can't bear to remember fully. Something in his tone suggested he was speaking from experience, and I found myself wanting to know more about what Alex carried, what memories he held at a careful distance. Is that what draws you to these particular books? I asked. The way they deal with difficult subjects? Alex was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider how much to reveal. Maybe. I think I'm attracted to writers who don't look away from complicated truths, who can hold multiple contradictions at the same time. Like Vuong writing about loving and resenting his family simultaneously. Exactly. Or Morrison showing us that survival sometimes requires forgetting, but forgetting has its own costs. Alex glanced at me. Real life is messier than most people want to acknowledge. I appreciate writers who can sit with that messiness. We'd reached our usual stopping point, but neither of us made a move toward our cars. The campus was quiet around us, most of the buildings dark except for the library and the occasional lighted window in the dorms. Can I ask you something? Alex said, echoing his question from a few weeks earlier. Of course. Do you ever feel like you're living at a distance from your own life? Like you're observing it instead of actually experiencing it? The question hit me more directly than I'd expected. Yeah, I do. Is that why you think you're drawn to literature? Because the characters seem more real than real life? Sometimes. But lately. He trailed off, seeming to debate whether to continue. Lately what? Lately I feel more present, like I'm actually inhabiting my life instead of just watching it happen. Alex looked at me directly. I think it has to do with having something to look forward to, someone to share ideas with. The words hung in the air between us, more direct than anything either of us had said before. I felt my heart rate pick up, aware that we were approaching territory that neither of us had explicitly acknowledged. I know what you mean, I said quietly. These classes have become the best part of my week. Just the classes? The question was gentle but pointed, and I realized we were finally addressing the thing we'd been circling around for weeks. Not just the classes, I admitted. Alex smiled, and this time it wasn't the small, careful smile I'd grown accustomed to. This was wider, more open, like he'd been holding back and had finally decided to let something show. Good, he said. I was hoping I wasn't imagining things. We stood there grinning at each other like idiots, and I felt something shift inside my chest. A loosening, like I'd been holding my breath for weeks and could finally exhale. So what do we do now? I asked. I don't know. I've never been in this situation before. What situation? Being interested in someone I met in a literature class. It feels very academic, like I should be writing a paper about it. I laughed, surprising myself with how natural it sounded. What would the thesis be? Something about the intersection of intellectual and emotional attraction, The way shared ideas can create intimacy. That's a terrible thesis, way too broad. You're right, I'd need to narrow it down. Alex pretended to consider. How about the transformative power of having someone actually listen when you talk about books? Better, more specific. Or, why discussing Baldwin's treatment of shame made me realize I was developing feelings for my classmate. The comment was light, teasing, but it acknowledged something real that we'd both been avoiding. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the directness of it, the way he'd named what was happening between us. That's definitely specific enough, I managed. Too specific? No, not too specific. We were standing closer now, though I couldn't say exactly when that had happened. Close enough that I could see the way the streetlight caught in his eyes. Close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow that I'd never seen before. Sam, Alex said, and my name sounded different in his voice tonight, softer, more careful. Yeah? I should probably tell you that I've been looking forward to seeing you all week. Not just for the class discussions, just seeing you. The admission sent warmth spreading through my chest, settling somewhere near my heart. I've been looking forward to seeing you too. And I should probably also tell you that I've been hoping we'd eventually have this conversation, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Hey, want to discuss the homoerotic subtext in our classroom interactions? Seemed a little too on the nose. I laughed again, feeling giddy with the relief of finally talking about what had been building between us. That would have been very on the nose, but effective. I'll remember that for next time. Next time? Next time I develop feelings for someone in an English class, though I'm hoping there won't be a next time. The comment was casual, but there was something underneath it, a suggestion of wanting this, whatever this was, to be significant, to last beyond the semester. I'm hoping there won't be either, I said. We were definitely standing too close now for the conversation to be purely friendly, but neither of us seemed inclined to step back. The space between us felt charged, full of possibility and anticipation. So, Alex said quietly, what happens next? I don't know. What do you want to happen next? Honestly, I want to keep talking to you. About books, about everything else. I want to find out what you think about things that have nothing to do with literature. Alex paused. And I want to stop pretending that the best part of my week is the intellectual stimulation. What is it then? The best part? Getting to sit next to you for 2 hours twice a week. Hearing you laugh when Martinez says something ridiculous. Watching you get excited about an idea. Alex's voice was quieter now, more serious. Realizing that someone I barely know has become important to me in a way I didn't expect. The words settled over me like a warm coat, wrapping around all the uncertainty I'd been carrying about whether what I was feeling was reciprocated. You've become important to me too, I said. More important than makes sense for someone I've known for 6 weeks. Maybe sense is overrated. Coming from someone in a literature class, that's practically heresy. Morrison would approve. She's not big on things making sense in traditional ways. We were close enough now that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the way his breath formed small clouds in the cooler air. The rational part of my mind was cataloging all the reasons this was complicated. We were classmates. I barely knew him. I'd never been in a situation quite like this before. But the larger part of my mind had gone quiet, focused entirely on the present moment and the way Alex was looking at me. Sam, he said again, and this time my name sounded like a question. Yeah? I know this is probably moving faster than either of us planned, but I keep thinking that we've been building up to this for weeks. All those conversations about books, all that careful attention to each other's thoughts. Maybe it was always leading here. Maybe it was. And I keep thinking that if I don't say something now, if I wait until the semester ends or until I'm completely sure about what I'm feeling, I might miss my chance. Your chance for what? To find out if this thing between us is what I think it is. The honesty in his voice made my chest tight with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't quite excitement either. It was bigger than both, more encompassing. What do you think it is? I asked. I think it might be the beginning of something important. Something worth exploring. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to respond immediately. We stood there in the orange glow of the parking lot lights, the campus quiet around us, both of us suspended in the moment before whatever came next. So, Alex said eventually, what do you think? Worth exploring? Yeah, I said. and the word came out rough with emotion. Yeah, I think it is. The seventh week of class brought us to James Joyce, and Martinez assigned the Nausicaa episode from Ulysses, warning us about its stream of consciousness technique and suggesting we read it twice if necessary. I read it 3 times and still felt like I was grasping at fragments, trying to piece together meaning from Joyce's cascading associations and shifting perspectives. But I was having trouble concentrating on Joyce, or on anything else that wasn't related to the conversation Alex and I had shared in the parking lot. We'd acknowledged something between us, given it names like important and worth exploring, but we hadn't defined what exploration looked like. I found myself analyzing every interaction we'd had since that night, looking for signs of change or continuity. On the surface, our classroom routine remained the same. Alex still arrived a few minutes after me, still settled into the seat beside me with easy familiarity. We still shared glances during Martinez's lectures, still whispered brief comments during breaks. But there was a new quality to these interactions, a heightened awareness that made every casual touch of our hands when reaching for our notebooks feel significant. During the discussion of Joyce, Alex offered an interpretation of Molly Bloom's interior monologue that revealed he'd spent considerable time with the text. Joyce is showing us that consciousness isn't clean or organized, he said. Molly's thoughts move between desire, memory, practicality, and fantasy without clear transitions. It's more honest than most literary representations of how people actually think. But is honesty always valuable? Asked Margaret from the front row. Some of Molly's thoughts are quite explicit. Does Joyce need to show us everything? Alex considered this. Maybe the explicitness is the point. We're used to literature that sanitizes desire, that makes it poetic or metaphorical. Joyce shows us that desire is often crude, immediate, mixed up with other concerns. It's not always beautiful, but it's real. I found myself thinking about this during the break, about the difference between sanitized and honest portrayals of attraction. What Alex and I were developing felt more like Joyce's version than the metaphorical kind. Messy, immediate, mixed up with intellectual attraction and simple physical awareness, and the peculiar intimacy of sharing space twice a week. What did you think about his answer? Alex asked, settling back into his seat after getting coffee from the machine in the hallway. About Joyce? About honesty versus beauty and how we represent desire. The question felt loaded, like he was asking about more than just literary technique. I think you were right. Honest is better than pretty, even when honest is uncomfortable. Alex nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about the value of saying things directly instead of dancing around them. In literature or in life? Both. We looked at each other for a moment, and I had the sense that we were having 2 conversations simultaneously, one about Joyce's portrayal of consciousness, another about our own reluctance to name what was happening between us. Direct can be scary, I said, but maybe scary is better than uncertain. Martinez chose that moment to resume the lecture, calling our attention back to Joyce's treatment of time and memory. But I spent the rest of the class thinking about Alex's comment, about the difference between scary and uncertain, about whether we were being honest about what we wanted from each other. After class, we walked to the parking lot through air that had grown noticeably colder. October was settling over the campus, bringing shorter days and the particular melancholy that comes with changing seasons. Can I ask you something? Alex said as we passed under the streetlights. You've been asking me that question for weeks now. And you keep saying yes. I don't want to assume. I smiled at his consideration. Yes, you can ask me something. Are we dating? The question was so direct, so unlike the careful way we'd been approaching every other aspect of our relationship, that I stopped walking. Are we dating? I repeated. I realize it's a strange question given that we've never actually been on a date, but I keep trying to figure out what to call this thing we're doing. We're not just classmates anymore, but we're not exactly friends either. What do you think we are? I think we're 2 people who are attracted to each other and are trying to figure out how to move from intellectual compatibility to something more personal. Alex stopped walking too, turning to face me, but I'm not sure what the next step looks like. The honesty of the answer made something loosen in my chest. We'd been circling around this question for weeks, both of us aware that our connection had moved beyond friendship, but neither wanting to presume too much. I don't know what the next step looks like either, I admitted. I've never been in this situation before. What situation? Meeting someone in a class and developing feelings for them, it feels like it should come with a handbook or something. Alex laughed. Chapter 1. How to transition from discussing literature to actually dating without making things awkward in class. Chapter 2. Is it weird to hold hands when you're analyzing Joyce together? Chapter 3. What do you do when you realize you're more interested in your classmate than in your coursework? We were both grinning now, the tension of unasked questions dissolving into something lighter and more playful. So, I said, do you want to find out what the next step looks like? Yeah, I do. What did you have in mind? Alex was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider the question seriously. Something simple. Something that lets us talk without the structure of class discussion. Something that feels like… He paused, searching for the right words. Like we're choosing to spend time together, not just ending up in the same place twice a week. The distinction he was making felt important. What we'd been doing was finding each other, recognizing a connection, building something within the constraints of our shared schedule. What he was suggesting was actively choosing each other, making time that belonged just to us. That sounds good, I said. What kind of something simple? Coffee? A real conversation that isn't interrupted by breaks or other students or time limits? The suggestion was so reasonable, so perfectly logical, that I wondered why we'd been dancing around it for weeks. I'd like that, I said. Good. How about… Alex paused, seeming to realize we were actually making plans, moving from hypothetical to concrete. How about after Thursday's class? There's a place called the Blue Door that stays open late. It's quiet, good for talking. The Blue Door, okay? Okay. We stood there smiling at each other, and I felt a flutter of nervous excitement at the prospect of seeing Alex somewhere other than the fluorescent-lit classroom, of having a conversation that wasn't constrained by the presence of other people or the structure of academic discussion. This is probably going to change things, Alex said. Probably. Are you okay with that? I thought about the careful equilibrium we'd established over the past 7 weeks, about the risk of disrupting something that had been working well, about the possibility that moving forward might also mean the possibility of losing what we already had. But then I thought about the alternative, about continuing to see Alex twice a week and pretending that the electricity between us was purely intellectual, about letting the semester end without ever finding out what we might become if we were brave enough to try. Yeah, I said. I'm okay with that. Good. Because I've been wanting to have a real conversation with you for weeks now. What do you mean, real conversation? One where I can ask you about things that have nothing to do with our assigned reading, where you can tell me about your life outside of this classroom. Alex shifted his messenger bag to his other shoulder. I want to know what you think about when you're not thinking about literature. The prospect of being known by Alex in a more complete way sent warmth spreading through my chest. I want to know those things about you too. Thursday then. Thursday. But neither of us moved toward our cars. Instead, we stood there in the pool of streetlight, both of us seeming reluctant to end the conversation, to return to our separate lives and the days of waiting between classes. Sam, Alex said quietly. Yeah? I'm glad you stayed in the class. I'm glad you were sitting in that particular seat when I decided to show up late and unprepared. I'm glad too. And I'm glad we're finally talking about this instead of pretending it's not happening. Me too. Alex stepped closer, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. We were standing close enough, the moment felt charged with enough possibility, but instead he reached out and touched my arm briefly, just a quick pressure of his fingers against my sleeve. See you Thursday, he said. See you Thursday. I watched him walk to his car, then sat in my own car for several minutes before starting the engine. The conversation replayed in my mind as I drove home. His directness, his willingness to name what we were both feeling, the way he'd made space for uncertainty while still moving us forward. Back in my apartment, I tried to read the next assignment, but I kept thinking about Thursday, about sitting across from Alex in a coffee shop instead of beside him in a classroom, about the conversation we'd have when we weren't constrained by the presence of other people or the structure of academic discussion. It was just coffee, just a conversation. But it felt like the beginning of something that could reshape everything I thought I knew about what I wanted from my life. Thursday's class seemed to move in slow motion. Martinez led us through a discussion of Joyce's use of language, the way he bent English into new shapes to capture the rhythms of thought and speech. Alex participated as thoughtfully as always, but I caught him glancing at his watch more frequently than usual, and I wondered if he was feeling the same restless anticipation that had been building in me all week. During the break, instead of our usual quiet conversation, we both seemed unusually aware of the other students around us, of the fact that this was the last break we'd spend as just classmates, that after tonight we'd be something else entirely. "Still okay with coffee?" Alex asked quietly, and Aiden